Gil. With that, I haven't had that kind of introduction since my mother died. Thank you all for inviting me to be part of your SAJE gathering today. Looks like we're going to fit it in before the torrential rains arrive later. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. A little bit louder, please.
All right.
All the way back.
All right.
Yeah.
So, Gil has given most of my background, but left out an important fact, which is that I wasn't born in Rye, but my parents were living in Rye when I was born in Manhattan. So I can really call myself a Rye native. And after 5 years in Colorado, as Gil mentioned, I decided that I'd rather hire lawyers than be one, and I moved back with my wife Barbara to Westchester County. Back for me, it was new to her, and we lived in Bronxville, or what we call Bronkers, the part of Bronkers that has a Bronxville post office address. If you know where Sarah Lawrence is, that's Bronkers. And then we moved, for me, again, back to Rye in 1966. So, been back here for a while, and brought our two daughters up here, and they are now married, and one lives in Manhattan, one lives in Wellesley, Mass, and each of them has 3 children, so we're blessed in lots of ways. So as Gil mentioned, when I retired from, after 5 years, quote, retired from the legal profession, I went to work at J.P. Morgan, the real J.P. Morgan, not the one that merged with Chase. And that was a good run, but also I started toward the end of my career there to realize that I had a fascination for writing. So I started working on a book. A friend of mine introduced me to her agent. I called the agent, described the book, and she said, "Oh, don't quit your daytime job." I never wrote that book. Anyway, when Gil asked me to talk to you about the history of the Jewish experience in Westchester County over the past 250 years or so, I was flattered but unsure that my knowledge of local history would, as a Goy, qualify me for the assignment. However, my role model is David McCullough, who is our greatest living writer of history, in my opinion. And he delves into various historical subjects like the Brooklyn Bridge and the Panama Canal without being an engineer or even a credentialed historian. I think he graduated from Yale with a degree in literature, I think. So I want to thank John Recadolf, who gave me a brief tour of the impressive renovations here recently. It's been many years since we attended the bar and bat mitzvah services here for school friends of our daughters. However, we are longtime subscribers to the Westchester Chamber Music Society's concerts at Temple Emmanuel. So that is the one on Westchester Avenue. So I may go to Temple more often than I go to church in some years. Let me start with a rhetorical question to which there is no one answer, namely, at what point do current events become history? The best answers, in my opinion, deal with the need for historical distance or perspective. The time frame for my remarks ends shortly after World War I and begins with the year 1492. Let me explain. 1492 is famous, as we all know, as the year Columbus discovered the New World. but it is also infamous as the year that King Ferdinand of Spain banished the Jews from the entire Spanish realm and confiscated their property, those that lived anyway. Those who did not convert to Christianity, called conversos, fled to Portugal and elsewhere, including Brazil. These, and if I get my pronunciation wrong, please correct me, the Sephardim were originally Jews of Spanish or Portuguese ancestry, but the term is now applied to Jews of the Middle East and North Africa. By the end of the 1500s, religious and other hardships in Brazil caused a number of Portuguese conversos to move to the Netherlands. Dutch Protestants who had gained independence from Spain in 1561 were welcoming many refugees from Catholic oppression. Within a generation, there were Jewish shareholders of the Dutch West India Company, which oversaw the Dutch settlement of New Amsterdam and all of New Netherlands, of course, later renamed New York, or New York City for New Amsterdam and New York State for New Netherlands. The first Jewish immigrants to land in New Amsterdam arrived in, anybody got a guess, the year?
1521.
Well, close, 1654.
Wow.
1654. Interesting because Rye was founded in 1660. So they arrived from South America, Barbados, and some of the other islands mainly. And in 1655, another group arrived from Holland. These are small groups now, 21 or 22 in 1654, and a like amount number, I think, in 1655. Thanks to the influence of the Jewish shareholders in the Dutch West India Company, Peter Stuyvesant, the governor of New Amsterdam, was instructed to, quote, allow the Jewish settlers to settle, worship, and trade in New Netherlands, provided the poor among them shall not become a burden on the company, but be supported by their own nation. Now, it's interesting, you know, that word nation was used quite precisely by Stuyvesant and continued to be used until well after the Revolutionary War, to apply to Jews. Despite those orders, the Jewish settlers faced discrimination from Peter Stuyvesant and others, and most of the community left by the time Britain won control of New York in 1664. So out went the Dutch, in came the Brits. By treaty, the Jews thereafter were guaranteed full rights of property, trade, worship, and inheritance, along with all residents in the colony of New York. Although Jews were not allowed to build a synagogue for many years, they held religious services in homes and then in rented space for their congregation, Shareth Israel. Okay with this pronunciation?
Yeah.
Often called the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, it is the oldest Jewish congregation in the United States, and until 1825 was the only Jewish congregation in New York City. It was not until 1730 that the congregation was able to build a synagogue of its own on what is now William Street in Lower Manhattan. Has any of you visited that site? Yeah. According to one historian, by the 1720s, the Ashkenazim already outnumbered the Sephardim among members of this congregation. The new synagogue set the tone for the colonial American Jewry by continuing to use the Sephardic form of worship because the congregation relied heavily on donations from the wealthier Sephardic communities, including those overseas. The congregation, recognizing that the Ashkenazim were more versed in Jewish law, engaged them for such synagogue functions as kosher butcher, inspector, and circumciser. However, for the conduct of worship, the New York congregation sought Sephardim who could chant in the Sephardic mode. They were greatly assisted by the appearance in 1761 of an English translation of the Sephardic prayer book for the eve of the holidays, followed 5 years later by a more complete prayer book for the whole year. These details about Shearith Israel are significant because of its importance to many of the early Jewish settlers in Westchester County. Among the most notable were members of the Hayes family, that's spelled H-A-Y-S, and whose Dutch name may have been de Haas, who immigrated from the Netherlands in the early 1700s. There were at least 6 brothers, starting with Jacob Hayes, who was naturalized in 1723, and according to the Jewish Encyclopedia, was one of the founders of Shearith Israel. Some years ago, a Hayes family descendant living in Pleasantville, in Westchester County, donated valuable family papers, deeds, inventories, letters, and documents from colonial times to the present to the Westchester County Historical Society. The papers include a genealogical chart that has a complete spread of marriages and dispersion of the family over the centuries. The Hayes family believes that the first member came to this country in the latter part of the 17th century, and the first indication of them in Westchester was in New Rochelle. An extract from the obituary of Benjamin Etting Hayes, written in 1858, said that, quote, his forefathers immigrated from Holland and with the first settlers. They came in their own vessel with their own cattle and agricultural implements to till the soil, as had been their occupation at home. Settling near New Rochelle, they remained plain, unassuming farmers, adhering rigorously to the Jewish laws, highly esteemed for their wealth, industry, and integrity, as well as for the assistance given their adopted country even before called upon. Rye's noted historian, Reverend Charles Baird, wrote in 1871, Jacob Hayes, with Titus Beekman of New York and others, in 1721, leased 40 acres in Rye for a period of 30 years to work mines thereon. Who knew? The land was, this is Baird still talking, the land was apparently on Hogpen Ridge. Okay, I'm looking at somebody who lives on Hogpen Ridge. That's Arthur. Ridge Street. Ridge Street.
Oh, that's Ridge Street.
That's Ridge Street. Hogpen Ridge. You can visualize the Hogpen. Anyway, so the land where Ridge Street connects Rye and Rye Brook. Baird also noted that Jacob Hayes, merchant in 1734, sold his lot where he now dwells in Rye. And it's not known what minerals they sought to find, but it's pretty clear that it was not a successful venture. Some say a form of iron ore. Among Jacob's children, Michael was a farmer in North Castle. This is all in Westchester. Benjamin ran a tavern in Bedford, and David ran a general store across the common from the tavern. David's wife, Esther, all these wonderful biblical names, is recalled by family members in heroic terms. While David was serving with the American forces on Long Island in the Revolutionary War, the British burned the Hayes home in Bedford and then burned the entire village of Bedford. In bed with a newborn infant, Esther Hayes had refused to disclose the whereabouts of a party of patriots attempting to drive a herd of cattle through the British lines to the American camp at White Plains. The Battle of White Plains was obviously, it was either about to start or was in course. Servants removed Esther and her infant and hid them in the woods until they could be rescued. Among the young boys engaged in moving the cattle through the enemy lines was a son, Jacob, then 7 years old. That Jacob later became the New York City's High Constable, or Chief of Police, for nearly a half-century. He moved from Westchester into New York City, and obviously became a very important citizen there. The youngest of the children of Esther's and David's children was Benjamin Etting Hayes, who I mentioned earlier, who lived in Pleasantville for 75 years. Uncle Ben, as he was widely known, was the only Jewish farmer in Westchester County in his day, yet he was strictly orthodox in his religious belief and adhered closely to all the forms and ceremonies observed by the most pious and devout. In order to conform to the prescribed dietary laws, he obtained authority to kill his own meat. The Hayes family collection at the Westchester Historical Society includes a certificate from an itinerant rabbi authorizing Mr. Hayes to practice kosher slaughter, and the knife he was given to do it. It is said that on his extensive farm he went over the fields a single time in harvesting the hay and the grain, while the leavings together with the fruit that fell to the ground were left for the benefit of the poor, thus following the biblical injunction. Uncle Ben was universally loved and respected. An old Quaker once assured him that he was the best Christian in Westchester County. He was also a man of generous impulses, and among his charities may be mentioned the donation of a piece of land to the trustees of the local school district on which to build a school, the sole proviso being that the school should be free to all without discrimination. David Hayes inherited the Pleasantville farm from Benjamin, but after he sold property, his son, Daniel Hayes, began buying back the Hayes land, eventually acquiring 52 acres, including the homestead. Some years later, he led the fight to incorporate the village of Pleasantville and served for 7 years as its second mayor. Daniel and his family spent winters in the city, New York City, and summers in the new home in Pleasantville, filling it with friends and relatives. These included Daniel's sister Rachel, her husband Cyrus Sulzberger, and their son Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, publisher of the New York Times from 1935 to 1961. The current publisher of the New York Times is Arthur Gregg Sulzberger, a great-grandson of Arthur Hayes Sulzberger. Tracing the connection of many generations of Hayes family to Westchester County provides a fascinating but somewhat rarefied view of the early Jewish experience in Westchester. However, before I broaden the scope, I want to mention one other remarkably successful person. I don't need that. Here I'm going to hand out we start that one around there and that around there. This man is, as you'll see, Moses Levy. As stated below the photo, it says Moses Levy, 1665-1725, the first definitively identified Jewish settler in Westchester, purchased 75 acres of land in 1760 on what is now Mersey Island in Rhode. You know, that's less than half a mile from here. Levy was one of the largest overseas traders of the early 18th century, in partnership with a member of the landed Phillips family. That's actually, although it sounds English, it was a Dutch family, so they date back. It was spelled with an E on the end originally. There's Phillips Manor along the Hudson. Moses Levy was born in Spain in about the year 1665, and when quite a young man went to London, where he engaged in business as a merchant and was the owner of many vessels. About 1705, he arrived in New York City. The author of an article about Levy wrote, "His vessels continued to make their way in foreign waters and occasionally pick up a prize, which was then considered an act of distinction." Now, a prize is a prize ship. It's basically authorized pirating. It's actually called a privateering. Actually, I have a son-in-law. His name is De Peister, so it's an old Dutch family name. And he likes to say that the reason that his family got along so well, when the Dutch handed control of New Netherlands, New Amsterdam to the Brits loved the fact that the De Peisters were very successful privateers and kept bringing these prize ships back, and they obviously had to pay some enormous tax, tariff, prize money to the government. In fact, there is a statue of someone named Jacobus de Peister in the Central Hall Park in New York City. And it must be the only statue ever erected to a tax collector. Well, that's what my son-in-law says. Anyway, so, his portrait, that is Levy's portrait, represents him as pointing to one of his ships. Well, he's going like this, he's not going like that. Probably in gratification at some more than ordinary act of daring which it had performed. Well, I would think it's probably because it brought more prize money than others. He was, for several years, and at the time of his death, Parnas, is that right? Parnas, president of the Shearith Israel congregation. It is said that Moses Levy originated the idea of erecting a synagogue to take the place of the frame building which had been for a long time in use on Mill Street, which later became William Street, and contributed money to fund the project. It was finally accomplished a few years after his death. An advertisement in the New York Gazette in 1726 stated that he wished to dispose of, quote, a house in the town of Rye with about 60 or 70 acres of upland and about 5 acres of meadow, together with part of a mansion belonging to John Heward, and now to Moses Levy in New York, or any part thereof on reasonable terms to any person that has a mind to purchase the same. I think it was sold after his death by his wife. And interestingly, I think later that property was owned by a Van Rensselaer, who was part of a big Dutch family with owned vast acres on both sides of the Hudson River, and this was one of the descendants of that family that came to Rye for whatever reason. But that was in the late mid-1800s. But yeah, according to an invaluable source called The Jews of Westchester, a social history, one of the first Jewish merchants in Westchester County was Raphael Jacobs of Rye. He and his sons conducted a business in the town of Rye for more than 30 years as commercial agents. He was offered the position of president of Shearith, Israel, but refused, probably due to the difficulty of traveling to New York City every week by stage coach on the Post Road. Although a majority of Jews who came to America in the early years were of Ashkenazic descent, the years from 1654 to about 1820 are generally referred to as the Sephardic period because it was Sephardic rituals that largely governed Jewish life then. According to the Columbia History of Jews and Judaism in America, a source of many of my remarks, Jews in early America did not face nearly the level of anti-Semitism here as they did in most of Europe. Jewish merchants were involved in the same businesses as their Christian counterparts, including trading in sugar, wine, and even to some extent slaves. Many of the Jewish immigrants, however, came from more simple backgrounds and started as peddlers or local merchants. There were cantors, teachers, and slaughterers in early America, but the first rabbi in America arrived in Baltimore in, another guess, what year? The first rabbi in America? 1840. A long time. For nearly 200 years, the gap was filled by lay leaders of various congregations. Despite their greater numbers, the Ashkenazim were slow to establish their own congregations, and the relations between the two divisions of Jewry remain remarkably harmonious in contrast to Europe and other New World colonies. In most of the American colonies, Jews were neither allowed to vote or hold public office. A notable exception, however, existed in New York City, starting in the 1680s. As I mentioned earlier, one of the sons of Jacob Hayes was the High Constable of New York City for many years. So, New York City is, and always has been, well, except for peace, a very open city. The American Revolution is said to have marked a turning point for the great majority of Jews who sided with the Patriots rather than as royalists. The leadership of Shearith Israel that fled New York City when the British gained occupation. It left the Jews who remained in Westchester feeling abandoned, and after the war, most never resumed their affiliation with it. After the war, only New York State prohibited religious conditions on political participation, and the other 12 states continued to prescribe religious tests for voting and serving in office. These restrictions lasted in some states into the 1820s. Again, the Columbia History is a valuable source providing insights into the broad trends in American Jewish life during most of the 19th century. For Jews who cared deeply about their faith, the lack of rabbinical leadership and the tough pioneer life discouraged immigration, but the hardships in their home countries and promise of opportunities persuaded many more to take the risk. Without the presence of rabbinical authority and the lack of other Jewish families nearby in Westchester County, some felt free from the constraints of strict religious observance. They also had to resolve their legal issues in the civil courts. It's reported that in 1736, Raphael Jacobs of Rye was the first Jew to file a suit in the Westchester Court of Common Pleas. He sued a certain Thomas Merritt, also of Rye, for £6, which he claimed was owed for goods received. One of the many interesting insights I found was the tendency of Westchester Jews of both sexes to remain single extended into the 19th century. Spinsterhood or intermarriage were often the only choices because Jewish fathers adamantly opposed intermarriage. Only the strongest-willed women defied them. Shearith Israel consistently rejected conversion and even denied synagogue feasts to the convert. Jacob Hayes, who became the High Constable of New York City, never again attended Shearith Israel after his marriage outside the faith. It is estimated that between 1820 and 1880, more than 250,000 Jews left their European homes for America. From roughly 2,500 Jews who lived along the East Coast in 1800, the total number swelled to about 1 million by 1900, all across the states. Typically, new arrivals started as peddlers, small businessmen, and agents between farmers and larger markets. Some were already trained in weaving, hat making, and other manufacturing. The commentator noted that many failures of Jewish businesses were traceable to inexperience and premature optimism of badly undercapitalized starts. One successful example, however, was the firm of Levinson and Baruch in Rye. Civil War veteran Bernard Baruch, not entirely different from the better known Bernard Baruch, married the daughter of Moses Levinson, a former peddler, and joined him in his clothing business. Between 1840 and 1860, the Jewish population in New York State rose from about 10,000 to 33,500. During the same period, Westchester County, which was inaccessible by 3 railroad lines, grew by more than 100% to more than 100,000, while roughly 750 Jews lived in the county, with Yonkers as the principal population center. Of the 300 first-time Jewish purchasers of real estate from 1850 to 1880, about 60% came from New York City, but most of the others came from Westchester, who had previously been renters. In that period, Mount Vernon attracted more of these property purchasers than any other community. Like Yonkers, it was served well by railroad as well as by trolleys, which attracted men and women working in New York City who could raise their families in the new suburbs. Before the 1880s, Westchester Jews had no permanent synagogues, social service organizations, or cemeteries. Founded in 1887, Ohad Zedek was the first permanent Westchester congregation, and in 1903 the congregation constructed a synagogue in Yonkers that eventually merged into one in Riverdale. About the same time, the Yonkers estate of former presidential candidate Samuel Tilden was bought by Samuel Untermeyer, one of New York City's most successful Jewish lawyers. This 150-acre property overlooking the Hudson River went into decline after Untermeyer's death, but its gardens and fountains have been wonderfully restored in recent years as a public park and conservancy by a nonprofit organization, and is well worth a visit. Has any of you been there?
Yes.
Yes.
Now, I recommend it for any and all. Just don't walk downhill. Stay on the upper level. It's a rather wonderful precipitous drop to the river. But you can enjoy it all right up on the top of the ridge. Over on the Long Island Sound side of Westchester, a Jewish presence grew slowly prior to World War I. Many steamboats and ferries came in and out of Portchester. Therefore, it became the commercial port for that part of the Sound, this part of the Sound. As a result, it attracted manufacturing plants primarily in the textile industry, which in turn drew Jewish workers who lived mainly on Traverse Avenue near the waterfront. I must admit, I didn't know where Traverse Avenue was, but we've all probably been on it more times than we realize. If you are, however you get to Portchester, but let's say you are going to Costco, or you're going to Stop and Shop, or you're going to the movies, that the avenue that runs underneath all of the parking and whatever, well, mainly parking, between the Stop and Shop side and the Petco side, that's Traverse Avenue. It traverses, unless it was named after Mr. Traverse. Anyway, the website of Congregation KTI in Portchester states on September 19, 1887, the first day of Rosh Hashanah, in the year, 5648. A group of about 20 Jews joined together in a private home on Pembroke Road in Greenwich, known then as East Portchester, to worship as a community. This marked the spiritual roots of the Jewish congregation known as Congregation Nissis,
Correct. Tifereth Israel.
Tifereth Israel, which today serves the greater Westchester, New York area, including Portchester, Rybrook, Rhine, New York, and Greenwich, Connecticut. According to my Westchester Jewish history resource, there were 5 Jewish families living in Mamaroneck in 1895, but the number doubled by 1900 and tripled by 1915 to 30. During the pre-war period, these families looked to New Rochelle for religious services. The website of Temple Israel of New Rochelle says that it was founded in 1908 by a small group of relatively prosperous Jewish families, mostly of German origin, who had moved from New York City to the suburb of New Rochelle. Anshe? Sholem? Then the only other synagogue in New Rochelle used an Eastern European style of Orthodox worship. Founded in 1896, it is the quote, oldest continuously functioning Orthodox shul in Westchester. As you know, this synagogue was established on the estate of George D. Barron, who moved to Rye in 1903. 2 years later, his handsome neoclassical mansion, and here, I'll end this up. You've seen this photo, but this is to remind you what it looked like before the renovations, well, before it was turned down, that is. But he moved it to Rye in 1903. 2 years later, his handsome neoclassical mansion was completed on his 41-acre estate, which he named Villa Aurora. Barron had made his fortune in copper mining in Mexico and moved to the East Coast so his daughters could get a better education. He and his wife were very civic-minded and philanthropic, especially in their donations to the United Hospital and the Rye Free Reading Room. In fact, as Gil mentioned the Parsons family, John Parsons and his younger brother William, well, they, among other things, saved the square house from being demolished, bought it and gave it to the village of Rye, now this is the city. When William died, his wife gave the land on which we have the quote, village green, and built the library, and later the city hall was built. And George Barron gave the money for erecting the first library. Erecting the library it's also, as you probably noticed, undergoing a major renovation.
Was Barron Jewish?
Yeah.
Barron is Jewish?
Thought so. No?
I don't know, I was just asking. I never knew that, and that's why I asked.
I don't think they were Jewish.
All right.
No.
All right, well, you're a tough audience.
Well,
But you didn't notice all the other mistakes?
I didn't know one way or the other, I was just surprised, that's why I asked.
Yeah.
Is it Barron Court, right off Stuyvesant? I'm just saying, I don't know if
It could be, I don't know.
that's
All right,
called.
we're roaring toward a finish here.
I had heard that the Barons were anti-Semitic.
All right, that is circumstantial evidence, as lawyers say. Hearsay, sorry, it's hearsay evidence.
Did you say
Okay.
anti-Semitic or
Here we go.
anti-Semantic?
All right, before I end and ask for your questions and comments, I want to share with you this brief account from the memoir of a man, I just love this, who grew up in Yonkers before and during World War I, the book entitled Daddy, Tell Us About When You Were a Little Boy, 89 years and most of them fun, by someone named E, I don't know what he stands for, Snyder. Quote, my mom bought her meat from a kosher butcher whose shop was on Riverdale Avenue. He made his deliveries in good weather in a two-wheeled buggy drawn by the nicest horse. But on snowy days in winter, he used a sleigh and allowed us to ride with him the short distance to PS3 in Yonkers. Ah, for the good old days. Thank you.
Paul, the Hayes came over on their own ship,
That's what it said.
bringing their own cattle. Were they discriminated against in Holland? Is that why they wanted to leave? Or they leave, or they just thought there was extra opportunity?
Nobody said, but it sounded that if you figured that they were, I'd go with the latter because, to have such a retinue built up and all, it's not as if they were fleeing, and they obviously were well funded. Yes, Ron?
I think it's very interesting that Moses Levy bought what is now Nursing Island. And then, I guess after he sold it, it became restricted.
Yeah.
And it's only within the past, say, 50 years that Jewish families have moved back
Did
into
you say
Nursing.
50? 50?
Yeah, I would say in the last 50 years, maybe even longer, I'm not sure. But I know at least 50 years.
Right.
But it was restricted for a long time.
I can't say yea or nay. Certainly, you have two parts. You have North Nursing Island and South Nursing Island. North Nursing Island is a gated community, and therefore they have their own
Right.
rules, and therefore they probably could
Yeah,
do that.
that's
But
the
South
argument.
Nursing Island, as far as I know, even though it's got a gate now, my godmother lived there, and she, there was no sense of a membership associations, therefore it would have, and you couldn't in New York State certainly put a restriction in the deed. You could do it in,
The fact, you've got to talk about the Jews that came to Brooklyn.
to Brooklyn. Yeah, well, I was trying to relate it.
Westchester.
It's a different country.
Yeah, a different world.
How do you think Westchester got built? Because of the Jews in Brooklyn.
Well, good for them,
Yeah.
as they say.
Different discussion.
Yes, sir.
The name Baron.
You know how things just hit you for no reason.
B-A-R-O.
Yes, that's why we're,
That's what he was talking
You're
about.
talking about, didn't you?
yeah, yes.
Yeah.
You were the Baron, the question was whether the barons who owned this house building, were they Jewish or were they anti-Jewish?
Or just not Jewish.
Yeah, they were not Jewish. You were allowed to put in the deed of your home in New York State
How far back?
that the house may not be sold to a non-Christian
How far back?
person. Well, we bought a house in the Catskill Mountains, and that was in the deed of our house when we bought it in 1964. By then, the government had disallowed that in the
Yeah.
deeds, but
Right.
prior to that,
Yeah.
it was in the deed to our house.
Right.
Really?
Yes.
I think Loudon Woods too.
Loudon Woods, Appowamus area, you were
Yes.
not allowed, the Jews were not allowed to purchase there.
All,
No,
Irving
definitely
Lane.
not.
all interesting. Well, of course, the Roses lived on the Nursing Island for many years, but
Right.
But this
So
all
more than-
came later.
That was all
Yeah.
after the Second World War.
Right.
Before that, you could have restrictions as to who could buy land or home.
right. Well, anything else? Yes?
The Spanish and Portuguese synagogue that was once downtown is now on Central Park West and 71st Street.
Yes, and I am told that it's absolutely beautiful.
Yes, I know, I was married.
Westchester.
Oh, that's even more beautiful.
And that was built in the 1880s, I think. They moved up, I think there were two steps.
I wasn't there in the 80s.
You talked about Travis Avenue. Portchester had a synagogue on Travis Avenue.
Well, that would make sense.
That was its first synagogue.
You know what's there now? A distillery.
I was gonna say, what happened to it? That's what
It's
happened.
absolutely,
I have sampled some of their product at the distillery.
I've been there, it's a very
The
interesting.
synagogue of the
business.
foods.
Yeah.
It was one of the Spry trips. See what you
What
can
is
get
it?
into,
See,
John Spry.
let's see what's I saw a distillery in Toronto, it's fantastic.
Good, now we're getting some good tales.
Yes.
I think the descendants of the Levy family were major financiers of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. I think it was the son.
Of
And
Moses.
he was recognized by the First Continental Congress as being a major savior. And 18 years later, he died penniless.
I will look that up, that sounds very interesting. There is, interestingly, something I mentioned that I just discovered today. There is an organization called, well, basically it's Westchester Westchester Revolutionary War, those are the key words, 250. In 2026, it'll be the 250th anniversary of, obviously, the Declaration of Independence, Revolutionary War, and December 8th at the J Heritage Center, there's going to be a panel, there's a reenactment on the grounds, and there's a panel discussion of various aspects of the meaning of the revolution for Westchester. I've written an article or two about how Aaron Burr was actually commanded it was a company here in Westchester during the Battle of White Plains. Yes, officer.
There's one sentence under the picture I'm confused about, talking about Moses Levy. His testimony played a prominent part in the execution of the first Jew in the New York.
Yeah, I chose not to include that. However, but, and I cannot vaguely recall, are you interested? Shall I tell you more about that?
That's why I asked.
Well,
You don't have to get into all the detail.
well, let's see. I think it was, you know, in the era when you could be hung for stealing a loaf of bread, I think. I mean, that's actually, I think, the person who was hung was a thief.
Pictures of hung
You know,
people are hanged.
and I think it was simple as that. And how Moses, you know, added to the evidence that convicted and led to his execution. I don't know. Yes, ma'am.
How difficult was it to research all your information? Where did you get most of it from?
I've written 3 books. And the first one, Gil mentioned, my ancestor, who was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Georgia. I spent, I would say, something like 80% of my time in libraries, which meant a lot of time in Georgia. My mother was from Georgia. My second book, which is the Parsons book, I probably spent, well, and the 20% that I didn't spend in library, I spent online. So for the Parsons book, the first one was published in 2003, the second one in 2016. And there I probably spent 20% of my time in libraries and 80% of my time online doing research. And then this one that will be published in 2019. Probably 95% of my time online and 5% you know, either in libraries or reading books that I've ordered from libraries or that I purchased. So that's it. If you know where to go and what tools to use online, it's absolutely amazing. Of course, not just every year, but every 6 months or whatever, there are new tools. And what does it say about our libraries? Well, you know, we've got to rethink our libraries. And libraries are really now, I think, more social centers than they are learning centers.
They're reducing the number of books.
They are certainly reducing the number of books, but I mean, if you don't know about it, there's something called Google Books. How many of you have used Google Books? Google Books, if you use the computer at all, and you go on Google and there's a little search box, and underneath the search box, as I recall, it says on the far left, all. And then, not necessarily in this order, but it says images, maps, something else, other. So you go and you click on other, then it gives you about 4 choices, one of which is books. So, all right, this is all, you have to have something in the search box. So we'll say Moses Levy is in the search box. So, and you go over, I mean, you can look at all, and whatever, you can look at images, and you may well see that image of Moses Levy. And then you go over to the other, on books, click in, and it'll give you a number of books in which Moses Levy's name is mentioned. Now, of course, Moses Levy is not a unique name, so you may or may not have the right Moses Levy in these books. If the book is basically out of copyright, which is, who's a copyright lawyer here? Intellectual property. Is it 50 years, 75 years? I forget. These books have been digitized through a cooperative venture between or among Google and major university libraries, Harvard, Michigan, you know, Princeton, Yale, whatever, Stanford. And if the book is old enough and important enough, you can read the whole book online without paying anything. More important, for my purposes, you can highlight passages and then hit copy, and it'll go right into your text. But I mean, if you want to read parts of my Lumpkin book, you can read it. It's not old enough, and I won't guess as to whether it will be valuable enough that they will, after a while, you know, give you the whole book. The Parson book is also there, so there are a lot of books there.
You mentioned you're very familiar with and studied the history in Georgia of Lumpkin.
Yeah.
And it's a known fact that the first governor, the name was James Oglethorpe.
Good man.
Yes, well, that you can argue.
No, I mean, you're a good man.
No argument here.
His major advisor was sent over by the Jewish community in London, and he was responsible. Something happened in New York to the Sephardic Jewish group. They were persecuted by their own people, I guess. He got them to move to Georgia and
Savannah. Big Jewish community in
and
Savannah.
I recommend, if any of you driving down to Florida,
Yeah.
stop off there and visit. It's fascinating.
Well, and also Charleston,
Yeah.
South Carolina, which is where the other Bernard Baruch came from. Yeah, well, Oglethorpe, I mean, Georgia was founded by basically transported prisoners.
They got rid of their jails in Great Britain and said, send them over.
So, well, my ancestors moved south. They came through New England and moved south, so they didn't come over.
We'll take one more question.
It's not a question, just sort of to end your thing. Just a little anecdote, meaning nothing. When you mentioned Savannah, my wife and I were down at the synagogue in Savannah, which is the third oldest synagogue in the country. And when the Jews came there, they were escaping persecution in Europe. And they brought two things. They brought a circumcision kit and a Torah.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.